The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Seoul Imperial Hotel hummed with a light that seemed too bright, too judging, and far too expensive for Maya's comfort, casting prismatic shards of luminescence across a ballroom filled with South Korea's untouchable elite. She smoothed the silk of her crimson dress, a garment she had rented for a sum that made her stomach clench with guilt every time she thought about her daughter's upcoming tuition fees. But she needed this night, needed the illusion of grandeur, even if only for a few fleeting hours. Maya stood near the periphery of the swirling crowd. Clutching a glass of sparkling water she pretended was champagne, her eyes scanning the room not for contacts or business opportunities, but simply to absorb a world that felt light years away from the two-bedroom apartment in Queens where she usually spent her Friday nights scrubbing oatmeal out of onesies. The air smelled of expensive cologne, roasted duck, and the metallic tang of old money, a sensory overload that made her feel both invisible and conspicuously vibrant in her red gown against the sea of monotonous black tuxedos and pastel evening wear. In the center of the room, however, there was a void, a distinct circle of empty space that no one dared to encroach upon, creating a vacuum of silence amidst the orchestral swell of a waltz. At the heart of this isolation sat a man who looked less like a guest and more like a king on a throne of chrome and leather, his presence dominating the room despite his seated position. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp, angular cheekbones that could cut glass and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the light around him, yet his expression was one of profound, bored detachment. This was Jae-sung, the heir to the Cheonil syndicate, a man whose name was whispered in fear across 3 continents, though to Maya, unaware of the criminal undercurrents, he just looked like the loneliest person she had ever seen. He sat in a sleek, motorized wheelchair, his stillness an anchor in the moving room, flanked by 4 men in identical suits who scanned the crowd with the predatory intensity of Dobermans waiting for a command. Maya watched him for a long moment, captivated by the stark contrast between his youthful, powerful build, broad shoulders straining against a bespoke suit, and the inert machinery that cradled him. It wasn't pity she felt, but a strange, magnetic resonance, a recognition of someone else who was in the room but not of the room, someone wearing a mask just as heavy as hers. The string quartet transitioned into a piece that was hauntingly familiar, a melody that tugged at the memories of her own failed dreams of being a dancer before life and motherhood had anchored her to the ground. Without fully processing what she was doing, driven by a reckless impulse born of the music and the wine she hadn't drunk, Maya set her glass down on a passing tray. She moved toward him, the red silk of her dress flowing like liquid fire, cutting a path through the hesitation of the crowd, her heart hammering a rhythm against her ribs that drowned out the whispers rising in her wake like steam. Jae-sung had spent the last 15 years of his life observing the world from waist height, a vantage point that had taught him to read the deceit in a man's belt buckle and the fear in a woman's shifting stance, but it had also calcified his heart into something cold and impenetrable. He hated these galas, hated the pageantry of the families who bowed to his face and plotted his demise the moment his wheels turned away, and tonight was no exception until the red dress severed his line of sight. He watched the woman approach, a stunning anomaly in the monochromatic room, her skin glowing under the chandeliers, her gait confident yet devoid of the arrogance he was accustomed to. His head of security, a brute named Dae-sung, stepped forward instantly, a massive hand rising to intercept her, but Jae-sung flicked 2 fingers, a subtle, sharp command that froze the guard in his tracks. He was curious, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Maya stopped just inside the circle of his personal space, close enough that he could smell the faint, clean scent of vanilla and rain clinging to her skin, overriding the cloying perfumes of the gala. She looked down at him, not with the sympathy that usually made his bile rise, but with a playful, challenging spark in her eyes that made his breath hitch in his throat. "You look like you're plotting a murder or falling asleep," she said, her voice rich and melodic, carrying a warmth that seemed to thaw the air between them instantly. "The music is too good to waste on a brooding contest." The audacity of it stunned him into silence. No one spoke to him like that. Not his lieutenants, not his rivals, and certainly not strangers. "I don't dance," Jae-sung replied, his voice rough from disuse, the lie slipping out automatically, though it was less of a lie and more of a medical fact, or so he had believed for a decade and a half. Everyone dances, Maya countered, a smile pulling at the corner of her lips as she extended a hand toward him, palm open, an invitation that felt more like a summons. Even if it's just with your soul. But you look like you need to move. She didn't wait for his permission. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and calloused, the hands of a worker, a mother, wrapping around his cold, manicured ones. And then the impossible happened. As she pulled, gently but with an insistent, grounding strength, a jolt of electricity surged through Jae-sung's arm, bypassing the tangled, dormant pathways of his spine and igniting a fire in nerves that had been silent since the car crash that took his parents and his legs at 16. It wasn't a thought, it was an instinct, a primal reaction to her touch. He gripped her hand back, his knuckles turning white, and the world tilted. He pushed against the footrests, a groan of exertion and shock tearing from his throat, and the room gasped in a collective, terrified intake of breath. Slowly, agonizingly, but undeniably, Jae-sung rose. He stood, shaky and towering, his legs trembling under the sudden resumption of gravity, his eyes locked onto hers in a mixture of horror and euphoria. Maya's eyes widened, her mouth forming a silent "oh" as she realized the magnitude of what was happening, but she didn't let go. Instead, she stepped in closer, her other hand finding his shoulder to steady him, becoming the pillar he needed in a world that had suddenly become vertical again. The ballroom had fallen into a silence, so absolute it felt heavy, the kind of silence that precedes an explosion, with hundreds of eyes fixed on the miracle, or the curse breaking, in the center of the floor. Jae-sung felt the floor beneath the soles of his shoes, a sensation so overwhelming it made him dizzy. The texture of the carpet, the vibration of the cello through the floorboards, all of it rushing back in a sensory tsunami. He was standing. He was actually standing. He looked down at Maya, who was now looking up at him, realizing for the first time just how tall he was, her expression shifting from playful confidence to a profound, shared awe. "Don't let me fall," he whispered, the command vulnerable and terrified, stripped of his usual Mafia boss veneer. "I've got you," Maya whispered back, her voice fierce and protective, her hand sliding from his shoulder to the nape of his neck to anchor him. She began to sway, a microscopic movement at first, guiding his rigid body into the rhythm of the music that had continued to play, the musicians too professional or too terrified to stop. He followed her lead, his movements jagged and uncertain, like a marionette remembering its strings, but with every passing second, the muscle memory of his youth bled back into his limbs. They turned, a slow, clumsy rotation that felt to Jae-sung like flying, his hand trembling against the silk of her waist. He could see the shock on the faces of his men. The way Jae-sung's jaw had practically unhinged, but he couldn't look away from the woman who had resurrected him. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice gaining strength, the intense focus of his gaze making Maya feel as though she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. "Just Maya," she managed to say, breathless not from exertion but from the sheer intensity of his stare. Just a mom who wanted to dance. The absurdity of it struck him. A single mother from nowhere had just undone 15 years of paralysis with a smile and a hand pull, but he couldn't question the heat in his legs or the pounding of his heart. He pulled her closer, the gap between their bodies closing until he could feel the rise and fall of her chest, the contact stabilizing him more than any brace ever could. For a few minutes, the Korean Mafia boss and the woman in the red dress existed in a suspended reality, spinning slowly in the center of a hostile crowd, rewriting the laws of medicine and power with every shuffled step. As the song faded into a lingering, melancholic note, the spell wavered, and the physical toll of the exertion crashed into Jae-sung, his knees buckling slightly before he caught himself on Maya's solid frame. The murmur of the crowd erupted into a chaotic buzz of speculation and frantic phone calls, the news of the crippled king, walking surely already halfway to the ears of his enemies. "We need to go," he murmured, his voice tightening, the vulnerability evaporating as the instinct for survival kicked back in. He didn't sit back down, he refused to. Instead, he leaned heavily on Maya, signaling his guards with a sharp nod to clear a path. They moved toward the terrace doors, away from the prying eyes, a strange three-legged creature composed of two souls. Once they were outside in the cool night air, the sounds of the city traffic muffling the hysteria inside, Jae-sung collapsed onto a stone bench, his chest heaving, sweat beading on his forehead. Maya stood over him, her arms crossed, shivering slightly in the evening chill now that the adrenaline was fading. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling slightly, trying to mask the shock with humor. "So, you can walk. That feels like something you should have mentioned before I dragged you onto the floor." "I thought I broke you." Jae-sung looked up at her, wiping his face with a silk handkerchief, a dark, incredulous laugh bubbling up in his chest. "I couldn't," he said, the words feeling foreign. "I haven't stood since I was 16. Doctors said the nerves were severed." "Impossible," they said. He stared at his hands, then at his legs, then at her. "Until you grabbed me?" Maya blinked, processing this, the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. "I didn't do anything magic, I just asked." She sat down next to him, leaving a respectful distance, but the air between them was charged, electric with the unexplained connection. "Maybe you just needed a reason," she offered softly, looking out at the city lights. "Or maybe you just needed someone who didn't know you weren't supposed to." Jae-sung turned to look at her, really look at her, seeing the fatigue lines around her eyes that the makeup couldn't hide, the strength in her posture. "You have no idea what you've done, Maya," he said, his tone ominous but laced with a newfound reverence. "You didn't just make me dance. You just put a target on your back the size of this hotel." The doors to the terrace burst open before Maya could ask what he meant, and the reality of Jae-sung's world came crashing in with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. It wasn't his guards who entered, but a group of men wearing the distinct, silver lapel pins of the rival Hanguk clan, led by a man whose face was a roadmap of scars and bad intentions. They froze when they saw Jae-sung sitting on the bench, not in his chair, his posture erect and menacing even in exhaustion. The rumors fly fast. The leader sneered, though his eyes darted nervously to Jae-sung's legs. "We heard the cripple was performing miracles. We had to come see if it was a parlor trick." Jae-sung stood up again, the motion smoother this time, fueled by rage and the need to protect the woman beside him. He towered over the interlopers, his height restoring the physical dominance he had lost half a lifetime ago. "Leave," Jae-sung commanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated in Maya's chest. "Before I decide to test how well I can kick," the threat was valid, but Maya saw the tremor in his thigh, the way his hand sought the back of the bench for support. She stepped forward, surprisingly placing herself slightly in front of him, a mother lioness instinct kicking in despite the absurdity of defending a Mafia don. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, channeling the tone she used when her daughter refused to eat vegetables, firm, authoritative, and brokering no argument. "The performance is over. If you want an encore, you'll have to buy a ticket like everyone else. Now back off." The incongruity of her presence, a woman in a gala dress talking down to hardened gangsters, momentarily confused the men, buying Jae-sung's security team the precious seconds they needed to swarm the terrace, guns drawn, surrounding the intruders. As the Hanguk men were forcibly escorted away, Jae-sung looked at Maya with a mixture of fury and fascination. "You are either the bravest woman I have ever met or the most foolish," he said, reaching out to grip her arm, his touch possessing now, claiming, "They will come back. And they won't care that you're just a mom who wanted to dance. You're part of the story now." Maya looked at his hand on her arm, then up at his intense, dark eyes, realizing that her quiet life of school runs and overdue bills had just been irrevocably hijacked. "Well," she sighed, a nervous, breathless laugh escaping her. "I guess I'm keeping the dress then." The convoy of black SUVs cut through the neon-drenched arteries of Seoul like a streak of ink through water, the city blurring into ribbons of light against the tinted windows that separated Maya and Jae-sung from the rest of the world. Inside the oppressive luxury of the back seat, the silence was thick, not with the earlier tension of the ballroom, but with a sudden, suffocating intimacy that made the air feel thin. Jae-sung sat rigidly, his earlier burst of adrenaline fading into a grimace of suppressed agony, his legs, dormant for so long, now firing with phantom sparks and deep, aching throbs that made his knuckles white as he gripped the leather armrest. Maya watched him from the corner of her eye, the adrenaline of the confrontation on the terrace slowly transmuting into a bone-deep exhaustion, yet she couldn't look away from the man who had just dismantled his entire reality for her. She saw the bead of sweat tracing the sharp line of his jaw, the way his breath hitched in shallow, controlled rhythms, and the realization hit her that the monster the world feared was currently fighting a war inside his own body just to remain upright in his seat. "You're hurting," she stated, not as a question but as a soft observation, her voice cutting through the hum of the engine and the crackle of the security radios. Jae-sung didn't turn his head, his pride a fortress he was trying desperately to rebuild, but his hand relaxed slightly on the armrest, an invitation he didn't have the words to voice. "Sensory overload," he gritted out, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against the quiet. "My legs. They feel like they are burning and freezing at the same time. It's a price I am willing to pay, but it is unpleasant." Maya shifted, the rustle of her red silk dress loud in the confined space, and without asking for permission this time, she reached out and placed her hand over his clenched fist. The contact was grounding, her warmth seeping into his cold skin, and for the second time that night, the impossible happened. His breathing slowed, the chaotic firing of his nerves calming under her touch, as if her very presence was a sedative to his pain. "We aren't going to my apartment, are we?" she whispered, looking out at the skyline that was becoming increasingly unfamiliar, the buildings taller, the shadows deeper. Jae-sung turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers, a gesture so tender it felt more dangerous than the gun tucked in his jacket. "No," he replied, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "Your apartment is compromised. Until I know who leaked my condition, who was watching us. You are with me. I won't let the world punish you for my miracle." The penthouse was a cavern of glass and steel, suspended high above the city like a detached cloud, devoid of the clutter and warmth that made a house a home. It was a fortress of solitude designed for a man who lived his life in a chair, with wide lanes and low surfaces that screamed of his disability. As the heavy security doors sealed shut behind them, the facade Jae-sung had been maintaining finally crumbled, his legs giving way not in a fall, but in a controlled, agonizing surrender to gravity, and Jae-sung moved to catch him, but Jae-sung waved the guard away with a sharp hiss. He wanted to walk, he needed to walk, but his body was screaming in revolt. Maya stepped in where the guards feared to tread, slipping her arm around his waist, her shoulder wedging under his armpit to take his weight. "I've got you," she murmured, the refrain from the ballroom returning, but this time it was stripped of the glamour, raw and domestic. They moved together across the expansive living room, a slow, shuffling dance toward the massive gray sectional that dominated the center of the room. When he finally sank into the cushions, a groan of relief escaped him, his head falling back, eyes closing as the tension drained from his frame. Maya didn't retreat. Instead, she knelt before him, ignoring the absurdity of her gala gown pooling on the minimalist floor, and gently lifted his legs onto the ottoman. She began to unlace his shoes, her movements efficient yet reverent, treating his feet not as damaged goods, but as precious instruments that had just performed a symphony. Jae-sung opened his eyes, watching her through a haze of pain and wonder, seeing the way the light caught the curve of her neck, the focus in her eyes as she massaged the cramping muscles of his calves through his trousers. "You shouldn't be doing this," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I have staff. I have nurses." Maya looked up, her hands not stopping their rhythmic, soothing pressure. "You have employees," she corrected gently, her gaze locking with his. "Tonight, you don't need an employee, Jae-sung. You need a human being. And considering I'm the one who dragged you onto that dance floor, I take full responsibility for the aftershocks. The air between them shifted, the power dynamic dissolving completely. He wasn't the mafia boss, and she wasn't the struggling single mom. They were just two people in a high-rise at 2 a.m., bound by a physical miracle that defied logic. He reached out, his hand hovering before touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a hesitation that broke her heart. "I have not felt a touch without a price tag in 15 years, he confessed, the vulnerability in his eyes stark and terrifying. "I don't know how to pay you for this." Time seemed to lose its relevance as the night deepened, the city lights below turning into a galaxy of distant stars while they sat in the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse, a bottle of vintage wine open but barely touched between them. Maya had discarded her heels and was curled into the corner of the sofa, watching Jae-sung, who looked younger, softer, now that the armor of his suit jacket was discarded and his guard was down. They spoke in hushed tones, trading fragments of their lives like currency, building a bridge across the chasm of their disparate worlds. She told him about her daughter, a spirited 6-year-old named Sophie, who loved dinosaurs and refused to wear matching socks, painting a picture of a life that was chaotic, messy, and bursting with love, everything Jae-sung's sterile existence lacked. He listened with an intensity that made Maya flush, absorbing every detail about school runs and burned toast, as if she were recounting an epic saga. In return, he spoke of the accident, not the sanitized version the newspapers printed, but the visceral memory of metal screeching and the silence that followed, the crushing isolation of waking up in a body that felt like a prison. "I hated the world for a long time," he admitted, swirling the dark liquid in his glass, his gaze distant. "I built this empire not out of ambition, but out of spite. To prove that I could still crush them even if I couldn't stand over them," he turned to her, his dark eyes burning with a sudden, fierce clarity. "But tonight, when you looked at me, you didn't see the chair. You didn't see the crippled king. You just saw a man who was missing out on the music." He leaned forward, the distance between them evaporating. "Why, Maya? Why did you cross that room?" Maya felt her breath catch, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Because," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "I know what it looks like to be surrounded by people and still be completely alone. I saw myself in you." The confession hung in the air, fragile and profound. Jae-sung moved then, not with the jerky uncertainty of his legs, but with the fluid grace of his hands, cupping her face and drawing her in. The kiss was hesitant at first, a question asked in the silence, but when her lips parted against his, it deepened into something desperate and life-affirming, a collision of two lonely souls finally finding their match. It wasn't a kiss of lust, but of gratitude, of recognition, tasting of wine, and the salty tang of tears that neither of them realized they were shedding. The fragile peace of the night was shattered by the harsh, gray light of dawn and the intrusive buzz of the intercom, dragging them back from the precipice of their shared dream into the cold reality of Jae-sung's life. Maya woke to find herself draped in a cashmere throw, her head resting on Jae-sung's chest, the steady rhythm of his heart a lullaby she hadn't known she needed. But the moment she stirred, the tension was back in his body. He was already awake, staring at the ceiling with hard, calculating eyes. The door to the living area opened, and Dae-sung entered, his face grim, carrying a tablet that displayed a stream of surveillance photos. Photos of Maya entering the hotel, photos of her dancing, and, terrifyingly, a photo of her leaving her apartment building 2 days prior. "The Hanguk clan has been busy," Dae-sung reported, his voice devoid of emotion but heavy with implication. "They have identified her. They know about the child." The mention of Sophie sucked the air out of the room. Maya scrambled to sit up, the blanket falling away, panic seizing her throat. "What do you mean they know?" she demanded, her voice rising in hysteria. "She has nothing to do with this." Jae-sung silenced her with a raised hand, but his eyes were filled with a torment that terrified her more than the threat itself. He sat up, swinging his legs over the edge of the sofa, wincing as the stiffness returned, but pushing through it with grim determination. "They will use whatever leverage they can find to test if my recovery is real, or if it is a weakness," he said, his voice cold, reverting to the dawn she had met at the start of the night. He turned to her, his expression a mask of stone, though his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "You have to leave, Maya. I have a plane waiting at the private airfield. I will have you and your daughter flown to a safe house in Zurich within the hour. You will be invisible. You will be safe." It was a dismissal, a frantic attempt to cut the cord before it could be used to strangle her. He was pushing her away, retreating back into his fortress of solitude to draw the fire away from her. "I can't protect you if you are close to me," he said, the crack in his voice betraying his heartbreak. "I am a contagion. You were right to fear this world." Maya stood up, her red dress wrinkled and out of place in the morning light, but she looked like a warrior queen amidst the ruins. She looked at the tablet, then at the terrified face of her daughter in her mind, and finally at the man sitting on the edge of the sofa, the man who was trying to break his own heart to save hers. Fear was there, cold and biting, but beneath it was a rage and a love that she hadn't realized was so deep. "No," she said, the word ringing out like a gunshot in the silent room. Jae-sung looked up, stunned. "Maya, this isn't a negotiation. These men kill for sport." She stepped closer to him, invading his space, forcing him to look at her, to really see her. "I am a mother, Jae-sung. I have been fighting the world for Sophie since before she was born. You think running away makes us safe? It just makes us prey." She knelt between his knees, grabbing his hands, forcing his fists to unclench. "You stood up last night because I asked you to. You walked because we did it together. If you send me away, you go back to that chair. I know it, and you know it." She placed his hands on her waist, her eyes blazing with defiance. "We don't run. We finish the dance." Jae-sung stared at her, the mask crumbling completely, replacing the fear. He realized then that she wasn't just a catalyst for his physical recovery. She was the missing piece of his soul, the steel spine he had been lacking. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face, not the smile of a bored king, but of a conqueror who had just found something worth burning the world down for. "You are insane," he whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. Completely insane, he took a deep breath, and with a grunt of exertion that was more a war cry than a sound of pain, he pushed himself up. He stood, shaky but undeniable, towering over the room, holding Maya against him not for support this time, but for possession. He looked at Jae-sung, his eyes hard as diamonds. "Cancel the plane," Jae-sung commanded, his voice resonating with the full weight of his authority. "Bring the car. And bring my cane. If they want to see if the king can walk, I will walk right up to their front door." He looked down at Maya, pulling her into a fierce embrace, burying his face in her hair. "You stay by my side," he vowed into her ear, a promise sealed in blood and hope. "And I will make sure no one ever dares to stop the music again."